Hi guys, so this is a highly debated topic and one that I feel like I have to discuss as an autistic person with a YouTube channel. I feel like we all have to discuss it. And that is the statements from Uta Frith basically saying that autism is no longer a spectrum. So most of you are probably asking right now, who the fuck is Uta Frith? So Uta Frith, and I'm reading it here, is a German-British developmental psychologist and emeritus professor emeritus professor in cognitive development at the Institute of Cognitive Neuroscience at University London, UCL. She pioneered much of the current research into autism and dyslexia, and her book, Autism Explaining the Enigma, introduced the cognitive neuroscience of autism. She is also credited in creating Sally Ann test along with fellow scientists Alan Leslie and Simon Baron-Cohen. And the name I couldn't remember from the video. Simon Baron-Cohen is a cousin of Sacha Baron-Cohen. You might know the name. So quite a famous family there. And it's no joke. Had to get a Borat phrase in there. I'm reading this off my phone. I just thought I'd save a few facts so I could list them off before I get straight into the article. So the Sally Ann test, I get into that in a second. Yeah, I don't need to talk anymore. Um, Sally Ann test is a psychological test originally conceived by Daniel Dennett, used in the developmental psychology to measure a person's social cognitive ability to attribute false beliefs to others. All right. Yeah, no, that's the right way. Used in developmental psychology to measure a person's social cognitive ability to attribute false beliefs to others. Based on the earlier study by Wimmer and Perner in 1983, the Sally Ann test was also named by Simon Baron-Cohen, who we just mentioned there, Alan M. Leslie, and Uta Frith, who we are talking about today, who developed the test further in 1985. In 1988, Leslie and Frith repeated the experiment with human actors rather than dolls and found similar results. Okay. Test description says to develop an efficacious, so efficacy is what they're looking for here. Baron Cohen et al., Simon Baron Cohen, modified the puppet play paradigm of Wimmer and Perner 1983, in which puppets represent tangible characters in a story rather than hypothetical characters of pure storytelling. So it's a real life scenario played out with puppets, essentially. It's a fancy way of saying that. Rather than playing a story, you've got the puppets coming in. My name, actually, I have one here. My name is Julius, and all that crap. But yeah, so she's highly regarded in the world of autism and autism research. I believe she's 85 years old now, and many people are saying she's in cognitive decline, which is funny because a lot of her work has pioneered what we know about modern autism nowadays. So credit where it's due. But when I get into this, you're going to see just how, once again, the high functioning people are being fucked over once again. And I was looking at Autismatic, so Quinn from that, who I was in contact with, and then Adult with Autism, Paul from that. So they were both talking about it, and Paul's going to release a video. And I sent him a message saying I support this and I wanted to make a video on it myself. And I feel like it's like my responsibility to do it. So I want to share this article with you and we'll get right into it before I get sidetracked again. So I'll probably give a bit of backstory about Uta Frith. Uta Frith, Arne Hammer, I think her maiden name is, but let's get into it. So Uta Frith, why I no longer think autism is a spectrum. The autism spectrum has widened to the point of collapse, affecting how teachers should support autistic pupils in the classroom. Researcher Uta Frith tells Helen Amas. Namas. So that's her there. There's Uta. Das ist Uta. She's German, so that's why I'm saying it. So here we are now. So Helen Amas did the article, and here we are with Dame Uta Frith. I feel more and more under pressure to really think about this problem, says Dame Uta Frith, referring to the exponential rise in the number of young people being diagnosed with autism. So right off the bat, I just want to say do agree with that point. So what she's getting at there, and I've read more of her articles, I don't disagree with everything she says. You know, when you come into something, and that's what I talk about with not being biased. I came into it thinking, oh, fuck her, and I want to disagree with everything she says. She talks about the overdiagnosis of autism, which I think she's absolutely right about. You know, everyone can't have autism, but there's definitely an increase in it. Why that is, nobody knows. um, I feel like it's down to a number of things. So obviously, um, more and more people existing on planet Earth. So naturally, more people exist, more people with autism will be born. You know, that's the statistics behind it. But I also think that it runs in family. Well, I don't think that I know that, but I think the fact that it runs in families and there are supports in place for people with autism means they're having kids, which is a good thing. But those kids are obviously going to have more traits because, like it or not, we take after our parents, and that's probably the reason why. So she definitely has a point there. You know, and I also think that with everybody sensationalizing autism, we now think that someone feels like they're socially deficient, then they must have autism. Whereas that's not always the case. There's a number of different conditions that could explain being socially awkward. You know, it's not always autism. Just because someone's quirky or awkward does not mean they're autistic. And I feel like when you sensationalize anything, everybody thinks they have it. So it's a lot of people now wanting to be psychopaths, and I've heard autism be compared to psychopathy a lot, and they're not the same thing. You can definitely have psychopathy and be autistic, but that doesn't mean that the two are mutually exclusive or vice versa. You know, it's just a lot of bollocks, really. Um, a lot of people think they're bipolar, you know, because normal depression isn't enough, and then when you sensationalize bipolar, everyone thinks they have it, and then obviously that means the condition loses its effectiveness because if everybody has it, then nobody has it. You know, it's like syndrome. So it's funny because we're talking about autism and Asperger's syndrome, but Asperger's as it is. But it sounds weird when you say it. Everybody goes, "I have Asperger's," but it's Asperger's, unfortunately. Um, and it's a syndrome, but ironically, syndrome from The Incredibles got it right, you know, and he says, if I'm going to make everyone super, and when everyone's super, no one will be. So he wants to make everybody a superhero, which means that if everyone's a superhero, nobody is because nobody stands out, you know, everybody's the same. They have their own unique power. And geez, we hear a lot of my superpower and all this crap, like all this stupid language used, whereas, you know, you think of some fucker going around in a cape thinking they're Superman, and it's all very childish language, and I don't think it's helpful. I see why people do it, you know, but I think it also makes the condition a bit of a joke, and that's what it's become. So let's get on to this anyway. So this is what she said. So she said, I feel like we got into that. So I feel more and more under pressure to really think about this problem. Says Dame Uta Frith, referring to the exponential rise in the number of young people being diagnosed with autism. According to the Institute of Fiscal Studies, the number of children with EHCPs for autism spectrum disorder almost tripled between 2015 and 2025. According to, sorry, that's accounting for 40% of the total increase in EHCPs. So is that like referrals? I don't know what that stands for. Let me just see if I can find that out now. Doesn't say. EHCPs. Education, health, and care plan. That makes sense. Legally binding document in the UK for children and young people 0 to 25, so aged 0 to 25 years old. Education, health, and care plan. That makes sense, and that's in the UK. For anyone wondering, so it doesn't apply here in Ireland where I am. So yeah, it's almost tripled. That's right, in 10 years, accounting for 40% of the total increase in the education, health, and care plans. It's a rise that has placed unprecedented strain on schools and led the government to include autism as a focus of an independent review into rising demand for services for mental health, ADHD, and autism, which is set to report later this year. An independent review into this. So let's just take a quick look. Reject additional. I want to just look at this right now. So, a review launched into mental health, ADHD, and autism services. Now, this is in the UK, and just for anyone wondering, it's not worldwide. Government launches independent review to look at rising demand for mental health. All right, that's just telling us what we already know. Review will build clinical evidence base on mental health, autism, and ADHD services. It will examine what is driving rising demand for services, including inequalities in accessing support. Next step in government's 10-year health plan commitment to transforming mental health care. An independent review, we've already gone into, I don't need to tap on it again. Launching on Thursday, 4th of December 2025, so not too long ago, nearly 5 months ago. Will examine how the health system currently delivers mental health, ADHD, and autism services in order to help ensure children and adults get the right support. Yeah, so it's not just getting the support, get the right support. Okay, so Lord Darcy's independent investigation into the NHS, the National Health Service in the UK, found that the demand for mental health, ADHD, and autism services had risen, and many people who are autistic or have ADHD are struggling to access the right services and support. In 1993, 15.5% of 16 to 64-year-olds had a common mental health condition compared to 22.6% in 2023 to 2024. So what that's saying basically is um, it's quite a there's quite a similarity, you know. And I was talking to Rugby Jackal, and he's I won't give too much away, but he's nearly double my age, and a lot of what I talk about he relates to, you know. So he's at an age where autism wouldn't have been readily diagnosed, and we're having a good chat about that. And I'm not saying he is or isn't because he hasn't received the diagnosis, and that's his story to tell. So he's a really good friend of the channel, but I don't want to give away too much. But just want to say that there is a shocking overlap in symptoms, you know, which it's quite worrying. I think. Well, it's good that we can relate, and that's what my channel does, bring people together. But you know, that's 48 years in the difference, and they can relate. They've got similar and common mental health struggles compared to 22.6% in 2023 to 2024. Right. Meanwhile, 13 times more people were waiting for an autism assessment in September 2025 compared to April 2019. So, in just 6 years, 13 people, 13 times the number. And it's not as if we were doing very well to begin with. You take COVID into consideration as well, which just scuppered everything and set us back all around the world. Like everybody likes to act like things were peachy before COVID, and then the war and all these wars going on at the moment, and the oil crisis. Things were not good to begin with. They were already bad, and now they've gotten even worse. They've gotten completely unmanageable around the world, I would say. But this is from the UK, so since they've left the EU, Brexit has not been good for them, we should say. It's definitely not been good for them. It was a stupid decision, but their government made it. They knew better. So this review is the next step in the government's 10-year health plan commitment to transforming mental health care, ensuring people get the appropriate care, which will help bring down waiting lists. So if people are getting the right care, they don't need as long a waiting list because people are actually being dealt with. But saying dealt with means it sounds like they're going out being shot, but no, they're getting the care that they need is what I'm getting at. And then hopefully they go off the waiting lists. But the problem I see time and time again is there's not enough staff. So there's not enough staff. Waiting lists are really high because there's not enough staff. Staff are already stretched with how many people they can help out. And then another reason, once someone is deemed to be okay, you know, you're basically sorted now, you're fine. They lose the assistance they were getting because they're seen to be okay. But the reason they're okay is because of the assistance they were getting. But because everyone's stretched, they can't commit to that person anymore and they have to cut them out, you know. The addiction counsellor that I see, I used to see her once a week. Now I see her once every 2 months. It's already quite a long gap in between that I'm seeing her. And she was very helpful, just seeing someone checking in with them once a week. If you're paying for a private counsellor, it's like €60. That's a good price, so it's not exactly easy to pay that. But I'm thinking of going private because I need someone, definitely need someone. I was thinking of going to AA as well, Alcoholics Anonymous, just to help me out, help me stay sober and on the right track. But anyway, we'll get on to this article here. So this government is determined to ensure that everyone gets the care they need, regardless of their background or where they live. This review is being launched alongside extra funding of £688 million cash that is going towards hiring 8,500 additional mental health workers, expanding NHS talking therapies, and increasing the number of mental health emergency departments, which I think is a great idea. But will they be able to implement it? Is the question. This work, alongside this review, will help more people get the right support and stop waiting lists further rising. Yeah, because if you can get on top of it now and stop it from rising exponentially, then hopefully you can solve some of the damage anyway. Health and Social Care Secretary Wes Streeting said, I know from personal experience how devastating it can be for people who face poor mental health, have ADHD or autism, and can't get a diagnosis or the right support. I also know from speaking to clinicians how the diagnosis of these conditions is sharply rising. Yeah, which means you can have more patients and the lists are going to go up, and then not good. You're going to have more and more people on the list, which means that more and more people are struggling, which means you're going to have to provide more and more services. So we must look at this through a strictly clinical lens to get an evidence-based understanding of what we know, what we don't know, and what these patterns tell us about our mental health system, autism, and ADHD services. That's the only way we can ensure everyone gets timely access to accurate diagnosis and effective support. The independent review will be looking at rising demand for mental health, ADHD, and autism services and what is driving it. So, the increased burden on the NHS means that for too long, people with acute needs have faced long waits, had to navigate overstretched services, experienced inequalities in care, and felt abandoned when support was needed the most. A recent survey by Rethink Mental Illness set out how important it is to ensure people are getting the right support. For example, it found that some parents were resorting to private treatment to get their children the treatment they need, with one case study saying that the cost was leading to such severe hardship that they couldn't afford to eat regularly. So it's a trade off. Do we eat for the week? Do we look after ourselves? Or do we get our child the help they need desperately? And that's the trade off that you have to consider. And I'm sure a lot of parents would do that. You want your child to be happy after all, so you'd pay what you have to. Unfortunately, a lot of people are struggling. I'm just going to take this off because I'm roasting now. I was freezing, now I'm roasting. The review will explore why people are increasingly turning to the NHS and other services for support, the role of diagnosis and accessing help, and how appropriate current interventions are. So, how good are the current systems? It will recommend practical, evidence based approaches to prevention and early intervention and will be led by Professor Peter Fanagi, a clinical psychologist and national clinical advisor on children and young people's mental health. I'm sure I've heard that name before. It's not a Hungarian name. If anyone knows, let me know. The findings, which will be published in summer of 2026, so this year, will inform the government's 10-year health plan commitment to tackle the mental health crisis in adults and children. The review will appoint an advisory working group leader of leading academics, clinicians, epidemiological experts, charities, and people with lived experience to directly shape the recommendations and scrutinise the evidence. Professor Peter Fanagi, chair of the independent review, said, "This review will be a worthwhile one if it is built on solid ground." We will examine the evidence of care from research, from people with lived experience, and from clinicians working at the front line of mental health, autism, and ADHD services to understand in a grounded way what is driving rising demand. My aim is to test assumptions rigorously and listen closely to those most affected so that our recommendations are both honest and genuinely useful. We owe it to the children and families, young people and adults to provide government with advice that is proportionate, evidence based, and capable of improving people's lives. The review forms part of a wider package of action the government is taking to transform mental health care and improve support for people who are autistic or have ADHD, including recruiting 8,500 additional mental health workers to boost capacity across services, expanding NHS talking therapies so that 915,000 people complete a course of treatment by March of 2029, up from 670,000 last year, providing up to £120 million to bring the number of mental health emergency departments to around 85, supporting people in crisis. Accelerating the rollout of mental health support teams in schools and colleges to reach full national coverage by 2029, with £13 million invested to pilot enhanced training for staff. Supporting more inclusive environments for children, special educational needs and disabilities, send it, mate, through the Partnerships for Inclusion of Neurodiversity in Schools, PINS. Very good. Send PINS. The PINS programme. NHS England piloting 6 neighbourhood adult mental health centres open 24/7, bringing together community, crisis and inpatient care. Mark Rowland, Chief Executive at the Mental Health Foundation, said, we're encouraged to see the government launch this vital review into levels of poor mental health in England. This is a key moment to understand how the social, economic, and technological changes of the last decade have affected people's mental health and how we best respond. Too often, people, especially young people, have to reach crisis point before they get support, which is why it is welcome that this review brings a focus on the prevention of poor mental health as well as timely, person centered interventions. That's very well said. So, Mark Rowland, very well said. So that one there. Too often people, especially young people, have to reach crisis point before they get support. That's exactly it. So you're not enough of a problem. You're not sick enough to get help. You're doing fine. You're ticking along nicely. And I feel like for those who are labelled as autistic and high functioning, that's exactly what happens. You know, you're seen to be doing well, but you're trying your hardest and you just need the support so you don't fall into bad habits and you can't get back up, you know, once you fall off the wagon. And that's the thing. Prevention is the key. If you prevent it from ever happening in the first place, then you don't have this pile up. You know what I mean? And I feel like in Ireland and the UK, we're particularly bad at getting to the situation and stopping it before it actually builds and builds, you know. And by that point, it's too late. And it seems like it's worse in the US, you know. You have to pay extortionate amounts of money for healthcare over there, which is not good, you know. Won't even go there. But anyway, we'll get on to this. So Dr. Sarah Hughes, Chief Executive of Mind, said this is a huge opportunity to really understand what is driving increasing levels of mental illness, especially among our young people. Absolutely. More people need help than services can see. More people need help than services can see. Right. People's mental health deteriorates while they wait. Absolutely. And when people do get access to support, it is not always appropriate to their needs. We also need to be tackling the social and economic factors that are helping to drive increased demands. That's why it's vital that policymakers, providers, and the voluntary sector are pulling in the same direction. We're ready to contribute to the review, to bring people who are experts through lived experience to the table, and to make sure that the outcome is a system where everyone gets the support at the right time. Well said. Don't want to read through too many of these. All right, well, we've got enough there, so I'll read through the rest of them. It's not as long as I thought it was going to be. So, Dr. Sarah Hughes, now we're down to Dr. Lade Smith, CBE, President of the Royal College of Psychiatrists, said, we welcome this review and the appointment of Dr. Peter Fonagy, Simon Wesley, and Gillian Baird to lead it. With such leadership, we expect that the review will adequately consider the many complex reasons that more people are in need of mental ill health. Okay, need of mental ill health. Do they mean mental health? ADHD and autism support. So maybe mental illness help. Just confusing that word in there. It must be also vigorously identifying gaps in care, explore which methods of treatment and support already work, and be led by the best available evidence. Okay, one sec. So Lade Smith, she goes on to say that we have a real opportunity to ensure that millions of people receive the care they need both now and for generations to come, creating a lasting legacy of a healthy and productive population. The Royal College of Psychiatrists are ready to support this work and promote the voices of our patients who feel the effects of the challenges affecting services every day. Well said. And Baroness Anne Longfield, Executive Chair of the Centre of Young Lives, said, I welcome the announcement of this important review and the commitment to carry it out vigorously and speedily, fast. Nobody could disagree that there has been a significant worsening of children and young people's mental health over the last decade, that systems of support are unable to meet demand, and that serious reform is needed. We are seeing the long lasting consequences in our schools and in the growing number of young people outside education and employment. This crisis cannot continue, and this review can be the catalyst for delivering vastly improved support for children, young people, and their families when they need it and where they need it. So well said again. Mel Merritt, Head of Policy and Campaigns at the National Autistic Society, said, we welcome work to address the long lists and long waits and barriers to support autistic people face. So I'll say that again. So Mel Merritt, Head of Policy and Campaigns for the National Autistic Society, said, we welcome work to address the long waits and barriers to support autistic people face. So we know autistic people face health inequalities that affect their life expectancy. Addressing these inequalities is much needed and must be informed by those with a specialist knowledge of autism and by autistic people's lived experience. Exactly. A GP said to me before that I can read you all the literature in the world, but I am no more of an expert in autism than you are. You're more of an expert than me because you have lived experience. That's exactly it. You have the lived experience. He doesn't. So he can read you all the quotes that he wants. It's not going to make a difference because he doesn't know what it's actually like to be an autistic person and go through life. And I find that I can relate to a lot of people, even though we're vastly different in our hobbies and the way that we live, but we can relate to each other because we're autistic. And that proves to me that there is additional challenges that we face, which is why I don't think it's a superpower. It is a disorder for a reason, because we face additional challenges that the general population don't. But that's not saying that people aren't struggling. It's just there are certain things that we will struggle with, whether we like it or not. Like we're socially awkward, we struggle with loud environments. Our sensory systems are just fucking heightened. They're overwhelmed, which means that we're more susceptible to burnout. We get tired easier. We just have to kind of accept that. But I get into that anyway. I want to finish this quote from Mel Merritt. So he said, either he or she, it could be a man or a woman, Mel Gibson, and then Mel Gidroy. So we need urgent action because while we are currently seeing the number of people seeking an assessment leveling out, so it's going from being overwhelmed to leveling out slightly, the average waiting time is rocketing. Okay, so we get back to the original article um, that I was talking about. I just wanted to read that part there. So back to the original article anyway. Oh, fuck's sake, I hate when it does that. I'm going to share my screen again, so bear with me, please. Here we are. The shit that pops up in the news that you just do not care about. Try and stay away from the news as much as possible. Self-update. So Uta Frith tea, yes, if you want to have a look at it yourself, take a look and let me know what you think. So we get back to what she said, because this is the article driving a lot of people mental. So the independent review into rising demand for services for mental health, ADHD, and autism, which is set to report later this year. So that review that we just read through there in great detail is welcomed by Frith, who is Emeritus Professor in Cognitive Development at the Institute of Cognitive Neuroscience at University College London, UCL. So we've already gone through this, and the person who pioneered much of the research that underpins our current understanding of autism. So she says, very happy, she is happy to see that some action is being taken to understand why there's been such a dramatic increase in ASD, autism spectrum disorder diagnosis, and why we have such long waiting lists. The current situation is dire and something must be done. I agree, but that doesn't mean that you cut the diagnosis so that some people don't meet the criteria, you know. But we read on anyway. I won't make any judgments until I've read through the whole thing and given you my take on it. However, the issue of rising diagnoses is, Freud adds, something she has been. However, the issue of rising diagnoses is, Freud adds, something she has so far been hesitant to comment on due to the sensitivity of debates around overdiagnosis and uncertainty about how an already stretched SEND system should be best met. Sorry, fucking hell, all these abbreviations. So, the issue of rising diagnoses is, Freud adds, something she has been so far hesitant to comment on due to the sensitivity of debates around overdiagnosis and uncertainty about how an already stretched SEND system should best meet growing need. And we talked about what SEND is there, SEND pins. So you can go back and have a look at that if you want. So here we are now. So in the wake of the government proposing changes to EHCPS, Education, Health and Care Plan, and new tiers of support for pupils with SEND, um, we sat down with Free to discuss how her understanding of autism has changed during the course of her decades-long career and why she no longer believes that autism is a spectrum, and what this all means for how teachers work with autistic children. So now we go through, we're getting definitions here, so we're getting really into the meat and veg of it, or meat and drink of it, whatever that saying goes. But what is autism? How has it traditionally been defined? So autism is a neurodevelopmental disorder, which is to say that there is some pathology in the brain existing from birth. So that's an important one there. Yeah, it's a neurological disorder or a neurodevelopmental disorder. Um, which means that it's there since birth, and that's often why you'll see a lot of children who get diagnosed very young. I was diagnosed at age 7, and so it's there from a young age. And usually, when you get diagnosed younger, that's the more common thing. But people can be diagnosed when they're older in life as well. So you can be diagnosed at any age with it. Some people object to the word disorder, but that's what I would call it, and I would actually agree with that because you do see other children doing what's normal. They're able to socialize, and I just wasn't. So I have to agree with that. There is definitely something there that isn't quite aligned. And, it took me longer to get certain things, and I couldn't talk to strangers or even distant members of my family. So I would agree with that. I don't think it's a superpower, and I've talked about that before. So she says here it's lifelong, and the main features have to do with distinct problems in social communication and interaction. There is also an additional problem with what's called repetitive or restrictive behaviors. This can present as narrow interests or sensory issues. Think of Rain Man, when stuff falls in the ground. Now he had savant syndrome as well, so that doesn't mean that all autistic people are geniuses, but with savant syndrome, you can have photographic memory. But there's actually a lot of autistic people who have a learning disability as well, so they can't learn, and they'll have to have in-house care for the rest of their life. They won't be able to look after themselves essentially. But that doesn't mean that people who don't need that don't have all these issues. I had all of these. I had narrow interests, and I had social deficits 100%, and restrictive behaviors. Change is a very difficult thing. It's actually painful. But yeah, no, I had all of these, and there's no denying when I was younger, I presented with a lot of the symptoms of autism, and through working on myself, and to be perfectly honest, not accepting myself, pushing through and just trying to be other people's perception of normal, not feeling accepted, I got to where I am now. But you could argue at what cost? So neither of these characteristics has been researched sufficiently. Again, I agree with that. I'm not here to disagree with everything she says. Um, there are parts that I definitely agree with. So my lifetime's work has been to try to explain how you could have these particular difficulties. 20 years ago, behavioral geneticists came to the conclusion that the symptom to do with repetitive behavior have a different genetic origin from the ones relating to social communication and difficulties. Sorry. So 20 years ago, behavior geneticists came to the conclusion that the symptoms to do with repetitive behavior have a different genetic origin from the ones relating to social communication difficulties. Okay, so different origin. So that is interesting. It sure is, because I wonder how much the whole concept of autism will continue to hang together if we do find a different genetic basis for these two halves. But this is all still in flux. So it's all up in the air, basically. It's not decided on yet. Over the years, the basic definition of autism that I've given you, that it's lifelong and neurodevelopmental, and that there are communication difficulties and restricted behavior, has remained the same. It is generally accepted, but the interpretation of definition is a different matter because we've made it more inclusive. So now the question is, um, do you mean that the definition has come to include more people? The interviewer asks. Yes, nothing is a neat category, and we wanted to include the not so typical cases, and so we widened the criteria. And the idea came about that autism isn't just a single category, it is a spectrum. But that's very difficult because what's notable about being part of a huge spectrum that we all belong to, we're all neurodiverse, and we can accept this because all our brains are different. Again, I would agree with that, but it makes a medical diagnosis completely meaningless. Again, I agree with that. I must also highlight in this, I must, that I haven't actually read this whole article before doing this video, so I didn't know what to expect, and I think doing that intentionally was a good idea because I'm not biased one way or the other. I'm reading it as I go along, and I'm telling you guys what I think as I go along. Because you can form an opinion and think, I don't know. So I'm reading this with an open mind, is what I'm getting at. And yeah, 100%. If everyone's autistic, then nobody is. But I would say I hate people saying we're all on the spectrum, you know, um, because as she says correctly here, it makes a medical diagnosis completely meaningless, you know. Let's just stop that there for a second, because she does make a very valid point. If everyone's diagnosed with autism, nobody has it. So when I was younger, and I can communicate well now, I have two very close mates who were both autistic, and we would all be considered high functioning. Um, but we're all quite different. The way that I noticed that we are similar, so I think Uta Frith would agree with me on this. What are the common characteristics? I don't know why I keep doing inverted commas. I need to stop that. So the common characteristics that I see in myself and my two mates, Danny and Noel, that are both autistic, is we're quite, and they're not all bad. So I want to just point that out. Not all of the characteristics I'm going to mention are bad. We're definitely a bit more awkward. We're more awkward around people we don't know. And I've seen that a lot with us, more so than our neurotypical friends. Um, or at least ones that don't have autism, because I've got friends that have dyslexia and ADHD. So not autistic, I'm going to say instead. Not autistic. We're more awkward. We don't date as easily, so I've noticed that we haven't been able to form long relationships as well. I would consider Noel the most confident and well put together out of all of us. He's also probably the best looking, which helps. Um, he's been with the same girl for a while, but I've seen him get lots of female attention. But a good trait of his is that he won't act on it because he sees it as I'm with someone, so I'm not going to cheat on them. Whereas I see a lot of people who are not autistic and they think it's fine, oh, I still love my girlfriend, but I'll cheat, I'll sleep with this girl because I want to. And that's something I see more with non-autistic people than autistic people. We seem to think, if we like someone, we want to be with that person. We don't want to cheat on them. Whereas I see a lot of people who are not autistic think, well, I want to cheat on them. So if she never finds out or he never finds out, fuck it, who cares? I also noticed that if we say we're coming out, we will be out. So we stick to our word. We might be a bit late coming out, but we definitely show up when we say we will. We don't make false promises. The only times where I've said I'll go out and then I don't are when I'm having a panic attack and I can't think straight. Most of the time I fight through that. I push it down with things like alcohol and I show up anyway. But obviously I'm after getting a grip on that, so that's a plus, But there's definitely traits in us, even though we're all very different. Like I've played rugby, I've played football, I've played all different sports my whole life. Um, Danny hasn't. He wouldn't be very athletic, but he's very good with languages, and he's also quite good at music. Um, Noel would be quite fit, and he was in the Irish Army, so he's quite well built. He's lean, but he wouldn't be into rugby or football like I would. But we talk about exercise, and he did boxing as well, and I did boxing, so we had a chat about that. So, you find the common ground. I think we definitely read each other well, so it's nice to have those people that get you. You know what I mean? There's definitely overlapping traits there. Behavioral difficulties too, which I feel gets put on the autistic person a lot more when we act out, but we're not acting out being bad. We're acting out because we're in distress, and what causes us distress might be a lot less than the neurotypical. What they deem as nothing. They say reacts inappropriately, but if you have a heightened sensory system and people are pushing your buttons and trying to piss you off, aren't you going to react? I learned to push everything down because I was told my actions were inappropriate and my anger was too much. I had anger management issues, even though people were going out of their way to piss me off and annoy me and exclude me. They'd allow a neurotypical kid to do something, but then they wouldn't let me say, "Oh, I don't mind them doing it, but when you do it, it's weird." There was a lot of exclusion, definitely, and as I've talked about before, physically I could handle myself, but I noticed that a lot of people picked up on the fact that I couldn't really tell who was a friend and who wasn't. So people that pretend to be your friend and they'd ask you, could I have something off would you give me some sweets, let's say, and small little things. You'd think, oh yeah, we're friends, give it to them, but then they treat you like shit when they didn't need you. I find that a lot. And that's neurotypical kids, the ones who are supposedly normal. And they're just cute hooers, as we say in Ireland. They're better at getting away with stuff. We're too honest as autistic people, and as I've talked about learning to lie, because the world's dishonest. We are honest in a dishonest world, and I don't think it's ever been a better time to lie. You get away with lying. You get further for lying nowadays, I find, being fake. And that doesn't come naturally to us. So I hate the fact that autism is compared to psychopathy so much because a psychopath is a predator masquerading as a friend, whereas autistic people are doing their best to mask to I guess it can look similar because we are both masking, but we're not masking to prey on people. We're masking to fit in with people, whereas a psychopath might mask simply to take from someone, manipulate somebody. They know what they're doing and they're fake all the time. They lie about everything just to get ahead. They don't even really have a defined personality. They're just there to exploit vulnerable people. Um, Whereas we are that vulnerable person because we're more trusting. We naturally trust people a lot more. We take people at face value, and if someone tells us something, we believe them. That's the perfect person for a psychopath to manipulate. So I feel like we're easy prey for them, you know. But often people think, oh, you must be a psychopath if you're autistic because you've got no emotion and no empathy. I've got so much empathy. So does Paul from Adult with Autism. He doesn't watch the news purely because it overwhelms him. It overwhelms me seeing the shit on the news. I can't stomach it. It's too much, especially at the minute with all the evil going on in the world. If my family tell me, oh, did you see the news? I don't want to hear it because it's too much. There's so many misconceptions, and as it says here, and in the other article, the Independent Review, we need to expand our knowledge on what we think we know about autism and actually speak to people with lived experience. How are you going to know if you don't ask the people with the lived experience? We're not all a bunch of nerds sitting in reading comic books and playing video games all day. I'm quite outdoorsy, as you've seen. So would Noel, he'd be quite outdoorsy. And Danny's into his music and languages, he's quite personable. Lived in Spain for a little bit, and he picked up the language. So got a vast array of people there, and then throwing us all in the same category is harmful. But I also agree with Uta Frith here saying that if everyone's on a spectrum, nobody is, you know, because we all think differently, which is very true. So we get onto this anyway. With the purely categorical approach, you had a very rare number of cases that were quite precisely defined, and then lots of people who just missed that. It was felt this wasn't quite right, which is how we came to a spectrum based approach. But that still wasn't enough because of various cultural factors. The spectrum has gone on being more and more accommodating. I'm finding myself agreeing with you. Sure reminds me of someone. I can't tell who. Is it Dame Edna? Barry Humphries. It's more and more accommodating, and I think now it has come to its collapse. Well, let's see now. Is this where we start disagreeing, Uta? This is something that I don't think has been quite recognised because people still hang on to the idea that there is something that unites all the people who are diagnosed as autistic. I don't believe that anymore. So she doesn't believe it anymore. Maybe she used to. That would be a more accurate way to think about autism, if not as a spectrum. So, sorry, the interviewer asks, what would be a more accurate way to think about autism, if not as a spectrum? I think at least we have two big subgroups. I think we have, sorry, don't have any more liquid, so I'm going to take a breath. I think at least we have two big subgroups. The people who are diagnosed in early childhood, usually before age 3 or age 5. I was diagnosed at age 7, as I say, depending on things like their intellectual abilities and language, and another group diagnosed much later. So when I talk about adult with autism, Paul from that, he was diagnosed at 30, I think. And then Quinn from Autismatic was diagnosed at 13 years old. I was watching a video there, and I think he said it was 13. And if you watch Quinn, let us know. So he would be considered a late diagnosis. So it's weird because I was 7 years old. So don't know would I be considered late, but there was a lot of signs. Put it that way. So this population, sorry, let's look at it here. So the group diagnosed much later. This population is different. It is made up of a lot of adolescents, and among them, a lot of young women, because women mask a lot more than men. These are people without intellectual impairment who are perfectly able to communicate verbally and non verbally, but who might feel highly anxious in social situations. They are perhaps characterized mainly by a sort of hypersensitivity. So that's an interesting point there. So, if someone spoke to me when I was younger, I could just blank them. If I didn't know them, I didn't want to talk to them. I had a lot of communication difficulties. Now, my mum said I could speak to her and members of my instant family, but I definitely remember how I felt sick to the pit of my stomach, just thinking about talking to people. Um, and one of my dad's girlfriends, one of many, her older son, he was a bit older than me, and he brought two girls over to their house when we were staying there with our dad and his girlfriend. He hadn't told her she had to leave, but I remember I just couldn't talk to them. So there was a toy box, and I pretended I was looking for something in it. Now, it was probably very obvious, but I just didn't want to talk to them. So I hid in the thing, I buried my head in it like I was looking for something because it made me feel sick to my stomach thinking about talking to them. I just couldn't think of anything to talk about. I struggled even talking to him, I just couldn't find the common ground. And not only that, I didn't want to. I was only interested in what I was interested in. I've gone away from that a lot. Now I'll talk to anybody, which is why it pisses me off, when my family say, are you talking too much? And are you being over the top with people? And is that why they don't want to talk to you or they make fun of you? And I'm kind of like, no, I'm being perfectly friendly. And if they want to be arseholes to me, that's on them, not me. And I'm finally able to say that. I'm sick of always assuming I'm the one in the wrong. No, they were in the wrong, and I'm standing by that. It might sound arrogant, but this is coming from someone who always assumes that they are in the wrong and that they must have done something. And they're always trying to, I'm always trying to justify somebody might be having a bad day. Doesn't wash anymore, You don't get to take your bad day out on someone who's genuinely trying to hold it all together. And it pisses me off that I've tried so hard and gotten to a point where I was able to go into the workforce and contribute to society and actually told people there that I was autistic and they disregarded it or put the thing back on me. When I called them out for the way they were speaking to me, it was, now it's going to get busy. So don't take anything we say personally. That means basically we'll say whatever we want to you and you have to not say anything back or take it personally. Basically, you've called us out now, so we've no excuse to keep doing it, but we're going to do it anyway. And just know that we don't really mean it. We're just saying it. Sorry, that doesn't wash. That's just bullshit. How about you just don't speak to me poorly? You know? And then when I got accused of doing stuff that I didn't do, I stood up for myself because it was like, no, no, I'm not fucking having that. You know what I mean? And I was proud of myself for doing that. And then the person who was given out to me, thinking I was the one in the wrong, once I pointed out who was actually in the wrong, she didn't say anything to that person. So how fucking fair is that? Not very fair if you ask me, you know. So like it's going up to that point there. Like it's something I really want to talk about, and I've talked about it before. So they are perhaps characterized mainly by a sort of hypersensitivity. Most of the people I relate to with autism are people who were late diagnosed, but I wasn't late diagnosed. I was diagnosed 7 years old, which is quite young. Well, not according to their version of it, but I had significant communication difficulties, and couldn't verbalize a lot of stuff. Had my special interests. Made a huge effort to change myself, because I felt like I wasn't good enough, and I did that. And the principal of the primary school I was in said I was the worst case of autism she'd ever seen. I was so aggressive; it was very difficult to manage. So I basically felt ashamed of myself and felt like I had to change. So I changed all my behavior and became somewhat normal. And then fast forward to when I'm in college, and the doctor in the college that I went to see when I was really struggling, she said, "Oh, you can make eye contact and hold down a conversation." So she said this, and I'm not bullshitting you. Your autism seems to have gone into remission. And we're not talking about cancer. We're talking about a lifelong condition here. Like it doesn't go into remission. You get better maybe at managing certain symptoms, but it felt very invalidating because I was really struggling on the inside, and I just kept pushing through. And if you keep pushing through, things will get better, but they didn't. So I went from being the worst case of autism that my principal in the primary school had ever seen to you're normal, there's nothing wrong with you, get on with it. So I think there's a subgroup of people who try their hardest and they're not rewarded for it. they're actually punished for it, you know. Like the supports I need are not very high. And I've been told that when I've applied for supports, reasonable adjustments, as they call them. But so far, I haven't heard much back. You know, I haven't gotten much reasonable adjustments. So I'll read on here anyway. So that group, so the late diagnosed group, remember the subgroups of people who would have, so let's go back to the subgroups. People who are diagnosed in early childhood, usually before age 3 or age 5, and then they might have intellectual disabilities and be non-verbal, so they might have trouble for the rest of their lives. And then you have the group diagnosed much later, the high functioning group, who can be characterized by a sort of hypersensitivity but are able to communicate quite well. So that group is increasing at a rate that is just frightening, while the rate of the first group is only moderately increasing. And in autistic children with intellectual disability, there has not been any real increase. That group seems quite stable. Really? Okay. So basically the low functioning group is not really increasing much, you know, based on the population increasing. So the high functioning group is increasing at an exponential rate by what Dr. Frith is saying here. So now I think the people in the second group really do have problems. I would definitely not say that they are making it up. Making it up. Need to get my quotation marks in there. So she wouldn't say they are making it up, which is good to hear because she could be quite harsh and say, "Oh, they're just making it up." But she says, "But I would say that but I would say these problems are problems that are perhaps best treated." Let me try that again. Sorry. Now, I think the people in the second group, the high functioning group, really do have problems. I would definitely say that they are not making it up, but I would say that these are problems that can perhaps be treated much better than under the label of autism. I would fight for that label to be limited to the first group. So, what she's arguing here is unless you're low functioning, you shouldn't get the autism diagnosis. That's essentially what she's saying. Um, so, what I would ask is, where do I fall in that category? You know, because I wasn't diagnosed at 5, but age 7, like that's still quite young, you know. And I know people who weren't diagnosed until 14, 15, and yeah, they would have been able to speak and communicate a lot better than I would have done. But age 7, I think, is still young enough to be considered part of our first group, you know. Like I wasn't diagnosed in my teenage years. I was still a young child when I was diagnosed, and I was said to be, again, I'll say it, the worst case that the principal of my primary school had ever seen. So how the fuck do you go from that? And then you go from being given no hope whatsoever. Like I was told I wasn't going to go to school. I'd have to go to a special school. I wouldn't get a job. I wouldn't play rugby. I wouldn't be able to achieve anything. Like the amount of you can't, you won't. Like it's ridiculous. So while I agree with a lot of what she's saying here, I still think getting rid of the whole thing, I wouldn't get any support then under that. You know, I'd only get supports for depression. Whereas I've struggled a lot because of my autism and an inability to accept that I do have additional needs. Like I've only learned to drive now. That's much later than a lot of people. And I do get more nervous. I sometimes think, I don't sometimes, I always think that I'm making stuff up and that I'm just being difficult, but I genuinely find things a lot more stressful than a lot of people. It's just that I've gotten better at pushing through, which hasn't always served me well. Like I've gained a lot of weight, gotten pain in my neck and shoulders, but yeah, just learn to shut up and get on with it, and then you end up sweating buckets. You end up in really bad pain. You need to just lie down for the day, and that's why I'm saying I don't think what she's saying is right. But what about people who, like some autistic people, and I've seen this personally, they will allow their problems to just take over everybody else's lives, which is not fair at all on the family, friends, anybody. And then there are people who, like my problems used to take over my family's life a lot. Now that I've gotten better and more independent, I would say I don't bring my problems on them as much. Now, there's still shit that happens, but that's not saying they're perfect either, That's like saying that they're perfect and I'm not. No, we all have our own shit, but I do my best to get on with stuff, and to work when I can, but not always easy. Um, just a point I wanted to make there. So here we get to another question from the interviewer. Could an explanation for later diagnosis be that some people, particularly girls, are more able to successfully mask their symptoms? So we talk about masking. Um, Basically, you're suffering on the inside, but you're not letting it affect you on the outside. So the masking idea has no scientific basis, yet everybody, including the researchers and the clinicians, has been enamored with this idea. So they all buy into it. It's understandable because they listen to the lived experiences of people who say they've been masking, that they spend their time imitating what neurotypical people do, and they're exhausted every day because of this. So the harm is not the masking, but the exhaustion afterwards. I can't quite understand that because exhaustion could arise from lots of other causes. So I'll say right now why I'm exhausted. So imagine you wake up, right? And I've talked about it before. I have a tough time getting up early anyway, but I've managed it in jobs that I've been in, right? Somehow until it got too much. So this is what masking is. I used to freak the fuck out with any new experience, going somewhere I didn't know. I couldn't go anywhere I didn't like, or I didn't know. I struggled with a 20-minute bus ride before because I ended up in. So I went to school in Churchtown. I ended up on a bus going the wrong way to Tala, which is not far away. But I was freaking out and panicking, and I was only 13 years old there, Um, I was old enough where you think you'd be able to get the bus home on your own, but I got the wrong one. And I was freaking the fuck out. Fast forward a couple of years later, and I'm 17. So 6 years, sorry, 6 years, what am I talking about? 4 years later, I'm 17 and I was getting the bus out to Blanchardstown from my house. So that's two buses and it's a 2 hour trip. And I was doing it no bother. I didn't even know how to get there. I just thought one will get me to the city centre. And then surely there's a bus that goes out to Blanchardstown from the city centre, which there was. It's quite the trip, let me tell you. Goes through a lot of dodgy areas, but I did it, and I don't know how because 13-year-old Dan would have been freaking the fuck out. That's what masking is. Masking is getting on a loud packed bus or train with a lot of people bumping into you, and you're really tight to each other, and you're very uncomfortable, and not letting the body, just taking a deep breath and then going into a job, making small talk with people you don't know, trying to act like everything's going on normally, the hustle and bustle of the world, but it's extra loud, it's extra smelly and claustrophobic for you, and it is, and multitasking is so difficult. It really is trying to remember what you need. And now it could be a little bit of ADHD with me because, as I say, I need to look at that again because it was given to me, then it was retracted. And a lot of things that I say, a lot of people with ADHD and particularly ADHD, so autism, and ADHD, a lot of people with that relate to me more than general autistic people, but I also relate to them too. So a lot of autistic people are able to get places on time. I've never been able to get places on time. I always struggle with that. I'm a bit scatterbrained when it comes to that sort of thing. So might be something to look at down the line, but masking is getting on with stuff, even though you just want to go home and curl up, and die. Like you don't feel good if you sit in all day doing nothing. But that's all you want to do once you're out and about. Like I know if I go outside it'll make me feel better. But even today I'll give you an example. So it was raining when I woke up in the morning and it was bad. The wind was very bad. And I was delighted because I thought now I have an excuse not to go down to the beach and go swimming. Now I love going to the beach and going swimming, but ever since Alf got attacked and I was nervous about that, I was worried that I might see the man down there again, have an argument with him again, that he wouldn't be keeping his dog on a tight enough lead, and that there'd be a lot of people down there, that there might be a dangerous dog down there. Like I worry about everything, even though I love it. I'm relieved when there's an excuse not to do it because it just feels exhausting doing it. And I know I should, and I do. I still push myself. My instinct isn't, oh, yes, let's go. I have to force myself to do it. I'll sit indoors dwelling for ages. It takes me a while to do things because I just can't sum up the motivation to do it. And I find nowadays, in particular, you have to mask, like dating, job interviews. It's all very fake. You have to give the perfect impression. And as I was saying, us humans are imperfect by nature. I was only talking to the GP on Tuesday about that, and she was laughing when I said it because she's like, exactly. I say we're always told to strive for perfection, but perfection doesn't exist when humans are concerned. That's why we call it human error, because any science project you're doing is always liable to human error. We always fuck up and make mistakes, which is why we're always looking for robots and AI to do jobs nowadays. But I don't like that either, I will say. But we will inevitably make mistakes. We're all prone to it. And when you're expected to appear perfect and you're struggling just to appear normal, it feels even more exhausting, which is why I think a lot more people now are struggling with their mental health. And that if you can't quite understand masking, that's what masking is. Like I got up, I was late nearly every day for school because I just couldn't sum up the motivation to go. I knew I had to go, but I didn't want to go. I know a lot of people don't want to. I would get my arse in there, but I'd never be early. Couldn't even be on time. I struggled with that. Then when jobs came up, I knew I had to be on time if I wanted to get paid, so there was more motivation to do that. But especially in customer service jobs where you're back and forth with people saying, hi, have a nice day, when you don't really mean it. And I don't mean you being an arsehole, but having to talk with people all day, having to communicate back and forth while doing a task and then multitasking, it's fucking exhausting. That's where the exhaustion comes from. And having worked in kitchens, the hospitality sector, and in retail, that's where the masking comes in big time. And then that's not even factoring in people being arseholes and being difficult to work with, you know, because you're already exhausted from having to put on a show and a brave face and having to mask all day. So when a conflict comes up, you just haven't the energy to deal with it. That's why when you have to stand up for yourself, it's easier if you know what you were doing is right and you can call people out and say, you're wrong. I was doing exactly what I was supposed to do. You're being unreasonable, not me. That way you know exactly where you stand. And it doesn't take as much energy to sum up. The guy had a boss before that, well, manager more so. But after a busy lunch rush in the cafe that I worked in, you'd have to be doing orders back and forth. You'd be on hyperdrive, you'd be getting orders in and out all the time, non-stop, up until about 2 p.m. 2 or 3 p.m. And then after that rush, you take a deep breath. I'd always go to the toilet afterwards. So I didn't I just pissed myself in the shop. No. There was a bathroom down the end of the shop, so we were in a shopping centre. So it took me about 3 or 4 minutes to walk down, and just to walk down. And I'm a fast walker, but you had to put in the code. Then the door had to open. You had to walk upstairs, go around the back, and go to the toilet. The different stalls they had. And I was told I was too long because it took about 8 minutes to do it, 8 or 9 minutes. What I was doing in there was going to the toilet, yeah, but then I was taking a deep breath, splashing my face with water. I was wrecked, and I didn't go when we were in the lunch rush because I knew we had to get through all the orders that we were doing. So if you leave people in that, fair enough, you're leaving them in the lurch. I understood that. So I was like, okay, get through this. Then once the rush is done, because people are on their break from work, lots of people coming in now. Once you're done this, get yourself calm and then get back in. And I explained this, I said this to my manager and she told me I had to clock out for it, which I initially did, and I had a big problem with it. I said, but I'm going to the toilet, which is legally my right. And she said, yes, but you're taking so long. So if you're taking that long, you need to clock out. And I then saw people going for smoke breaks. So they were going out for over 10 minutes. And I said this, like, they're out over 10 minutes. And I know it sounds a bit petty, but I said, they don't have to clock out. Why do I? And then I said to her, I'm not doing it. And I knew my rights. And it was exhausting at first because I didn't want the hassle. But I just said, I'm not clocking out for it and you can't make me. Got that petty because it was like, if they're not being asked to clock out for their smoke breaks, I'm not clocking out for my toilet break. So she had no leg to stand on after that, really, you know. But that's where the masking comes from. Trying to do everything by the book and get on with people is hard enough. And I struggled to be on time for work because I was so depressed. I struggled to get out of bed. I struggled to get in. It was just way too much, way too fucking much, and interacting with the general public is hard for anyone. Can you imagine if your sensory system is in hyperdrive as well? So here's Uta Frith says, I expect we could say we are all masking all the time, trying to adapt to our society's norms. To a point, yes. I'm not going to say she's completely wrong in this, but there are there are different levels of this. She says, so from this point of view, I'm very critical of this idea. I think I've just explained it there. You're trying to get along, you're trying to act like you're not, you just don't want to scream at everybody and say, fuck off, but you can't do that in a civilized society. So she's critical of the idea of masking. She really doesn't like it. And I don't think she understands it. How could she? She's not autistic. There have always been girls with autism. The ratio was assumed to be 4-1 and more recently 3-1. In children diagnosed before age 10, this ratio has remained the same over decades. Is there cultural bias against identifying girls and women as autistic? Have they been unjustly overlooked? I don't think so. We know, for example, that psychopathy is overwhelmingly male. Do we ask whether psychopathic girls have ever been overlooked? I haven't seen anything like that. But I will disprove it right now. So I think the answer is definitely a yes. Females mask a lot more. It's shown that females with autism tend to get diagnosed much later because it's unladylike to be, having a meltdown or stamping your feet or biting your clothes because you're very uncomfortable. That's seen as more acceptable if you're a male. Not that it's seen as acceptable, but it's definitely more acceptable. And just like the case with borderline personality disorder, now emotionally unstable personality disorder, but that's seen as more of a female thing because women are more emotional. We just say in a very misogynistic way, that time of the month again. Women are allowed to be more emotional because they're expected to be, whereas men aren't. Men are supposed to be more in control, domineering, and aggressive, which is what psychopathy is. So I don't agree with this point at all. It's been shown in the research that borderline personality disorder is more of an equal ratio than people think. So instead of being like 80-20 for women, it's actually 60-40 for women and getting closer to 50-50. And I think it could be the same for autism. It's just how we look at things. Boys are more likely to stomp their feet or act out, whereas women aren't supposed to, but women are more emotional. So that's more acceptable for them. Whereas if a man's emotional, what's he told? Man the fuck up, stop being a bitch, stop complaining, stop being a pussy, grow a thicker skin, all these useless things that get thrown around. So do we ask whether psychopathic girls have ever been overlooked? I haven't seen anything like that. Even if they're psychopathic, they're more likely to get diagnosed with something like histrionic or borderline personality disorder because they're more female associated. I don't think we've done any research into that area, but I don't want to get sidetracked. So there are just diseases that are more common in males and diseases that are more common in females. So breast cancer would be more common in females, but my uncle has gotten breast cancer. So what does that tell you? It can happen. Obviously, testicular cancer. Women don't have balls, so they don't have testicles. How are they going to have testicular cancer? Naturally, males are going to get more of that. But males do have breasts. They're just not as voluptuous as women's females. Another way the category of autism has changed is that Asperger's syndrome is now no longer used as a diagnostic term. What effect has that had on how we understand autism? It's an interesting question, a very good one. Asperger's syndrome was introduced as an official diagnostic term in the 90s as a way of including people who would not fit the original autism description. These are people who have a fluent language, sometimes a high IQ, and yet still had very typical symptoms of autism. That was my official diagnosis at first. Well, actually, it was autism spectrum disorder, ASD. My mum told me it was Asperger's, so that's what I told everybody else. High functioning, apparently. This was a small group, but once the label was introduced, parents who wanted their children diagnosed were almost all pushing for a diagnosis of Asperger's syndrome. The label had acquired great cachet, perhaps because it was associated with certain figures from history and some famous scientists, Abraham Lincoln being one, Thomas Edison being another. Nikola Tesla, I'm not quite sure if he was. Anthony Hopkins, I believe, was diagnosed with it recently. So there's a few people there, you know. Perhaps the label held hope that even if a child needed significant support, they might have hidden super. There we go with the superpower shit again. That could enable them to do well in certain niche occupations. There's definitely my memory is a lot better than a lot of friends I know. If I'm interested in a subject, I can just remember it like that. But it's not always it being able to be applied the way I want it to be. So this category was becoming desirable for the wrong reasons. So people wanted it, because they associated it with famous people with superpowers. So this category was becoming desirable for the wrong reasons, and it was eventually abandoned in the latest Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, fifth edition. I think the consensus was we have the spectrum, so why do we want anything else? And yeah, you have people thinking, oh, my child is special or has superpowers. That was an interesting decision because it was assumed that a person could meet the diagnostic criteria for autism, whether or not they had language difficulties or intellectual difficulties. However, it was assumed that one could specify the level of support needs. But what actually happened is that sadly, the spectrum was stretched over and over into including people who would never have met the criteria of Asperger's syndrome. So I do see your point here that it is difficult, especially when you have people who aren't actually, they don't meet the criteria for that, the Asperger's syndrome, but they're just being thrown in there. And now parents want their kids to have that. Autism is seen as an intellectual disability, whereas Asperger's, oh, famous people throughout history have that, so we want that. We want Asperger's. That's like when I spoke about bipolar disorder, which my mate Oisin has, who was on the show, channel, I should say, I always say show, but on the channel being interviewed. A lot of creative people like Vincent van Gogh, not Van Gogh, Van Gogh. With a Dutch cousin, so I don't want to fuck that one up, but yeah, Van Gogh. So the spectrum has collapsed. So she's talking, sorry, I'll just go back to that point again. But what actually happened is that sadly the spectrum was stretched over and over into including people who would never have met the criteria of Asperger's syndrome. So the spectrum has collapsed, but we might still find meaningful subgroups, each with its own label. That's my view. But I know that other people would be totally against this. But yeah, we have to make more labels. I think we've got enough labels already. I don't know how that would work, but let's have a look at how exactly is autism diagnosed. So that might be helpful here. And the answer is these days, many people are self diagnosing before they are assessed, and that is definitely a problem. I have heard from clinicians that they feel themselves to be under severe pressure to give the diagnosis if the person has waited months or even years and feels absolutely sure that they're autistic. So if the person has waited and they think, I'm autistic, but if they're self-diagnosed, and a lot of questionnaires when it asks about autism, and I've seen it, it's like, have you been formally diagnosed or, have you self-diagnosed? And I don't think that that should be a question. If you haven't been diagnosed, you don't have the condition, or at least we don't know whether you have it or not yet, because someone doesn't just magically become autistic because they're given a diagnosis, but you shouldn't say you're autistic until you have a diagnosis. That's what I would say, because I think that does more harm than good. And I've had several family members say to me, "Oh, sure, we're all a little bit autistic," or "I think I have that." My dad, in particular, real throwaway stuff, and it's definitely impacted my life in a lot of ways. So for him to just say, "I have that," I think is very dismissive, and I've had several family members do that, and it doesn't help. It just makes you feel like you're making a mountain out of a molehill, and we all have that to varying degrees. So what makes you so special? I'm special because I'm autistic. There we are. So Uta goes on to say, I fear that the way assessments are made now may not be quite right. I get the sense that people are relying too much on detailed interviews that provide a lot of subjective experience rather than on objective clinical observation. For example, observing the flow of a conversation to spot indicators of poor reciprocal interaction, say in eye contact or body language. I would guess these are things that are difficult to mask. And that's where it comes in from a young age. So if you've learned to mask over time, if I get very nervous and very anxious, my eye contact goes to shit. I start kind of drifting over. I'm unable to hold the direct eye contact. There's actually a fella that I met when I was doing my theory test at Wexford Local Development, and he has ADHD, but his stepson has autism. And he said, "Oh, sure, I could tell you were autistic by the way you look away, when you're talking. You're obviously getting anxious, and don't be anxious around me." He wasn't saying it in an aggressive way. He was saying it as a, "Don't worry, I'm friendly. Don't worry about it at all." He was like, "Look after yourself and accept yourself for who you are, or you'll be very miserable." And I was like, he's dead right. But I really noticed that I was drifting, but I couldn't stop myself from doing it because it was so uncomfortable. I just didn't want to make eye contact. So I can kind of slip back into that even now, even having learned to stare at someone. And that's the thing, I make too much eye contact at times where I'm like that. I look quite creepy, but it's always hard to balance, isn't it? So observing the flow of a conversation to spot indicators of poor reciprocal interaction, say in eye contact or body language. I couldn't sit still. I've never been able to sit still, and I'm not trying to be rude. It's just that when I get interested about something, I will keep talking about it. And even my mum was saying when I was being assessed that I wasn't given any cue on when to stop speaking. So if I was asked a question, I would just keep talking until I was asked to stop. Like, what else are you supposed to do? So I would guess these are the things that are difficult to mask. I fear there also isn't enough attention being paid to what I would call the contraindications. Okay, so let's look at what they are. To me, for example, it's a contraindicator for the diagnosis of autism if the person can interact smoothly with you in a conversation. If a person is autistic, the conversation will often feel stilted or abrupt. But see, that was me, and then I learned. I learned a lot of skills, and I can still do it. Like I'm not immune to doing this, but not doing it to be rude. And I've pointed out to people before that if I do this, it's because I'm autistic. You know, just say you're doing that again, or but people will get pissy with me. To get in the mood with me and say the conversation felt very one-sided, or I told you how I was doing it. And when I look at people like Paul from Adult with Autism and Quinn from Autismatic, one thing they've said is, and I do this all the time, and my mate Noel and Danny, they both do it as well. And found with Usheen and Isabel, the friends that I've made from compassion focused therapy, we never say, "Oh, I understand what you're going through because this happened to me," to one up each other. We say it to relate to each other. Compassion, empathy. Whereas a lot of people, including my own family, will say, "Oh, you're making it all about you, you're making the competition." And I'm like, no, I understand because I've been through a similar situation and I'm trying to relate to you. Because people say, "Oh, you don't understand," and how would you know? And then you say how you know, and then it's like, "Oh, you're making it a competition or you're making it all about you." That's never my intent. My intent is always to find a common ground with people. But they don't always see it that way, you know. And if I'm interested in something, I will keep talking because in interviews or on dates, you always hear the big issue being you didn't speak enough, you know, there were too many pauses in the conversation. If you've got something to say, I'll listen, no problem. I might not always get it right when I pause or I stop talking, but I'll do my best. You know, I won't try, I won't interrupt you as you're mid sentence. Sometimes if people stop talking for a little bit to take a long breath, I think they've stopped talking and I jump in, but I'll then go, oh, sorry, you were saying, you know. So another contraindicator, in my view, is being able to read between the lines of the conversation and to get irony and humour. There could be a whole list of these contraindications, but let's go over that again. So another contraindicator, in my view, is being able to read between the lines in a conversation and to get irony and humour. I've said this before, I'm fucking Irish, so I'm not just Irish, I'm fucking Irish, but I'm Irish, so I have to get humour and irony. We're probably the most sarcastic nation and past remarkable group of people you'll ever meet. We say things we don't mean all the time, you know, and other people take offence and think that we're being aggressive or we're being rude. And we could be, you know, and I've seen people hide behind that. We're only slagging, you know, it's just banter, get over it. But say if we were in Uta Frith's homeland of Germany, Deutschland, German people are often a lot more serious and straight faced, you know, they don't laugh as much and they're seen as a bit humorless or rude. No, I don't think they're humorless and I don't think they're rude. I think they're very direct, but also same with Dutch people. You often know where you stand with them. I find it a lot easier to know where I stand with mainland Europeans. Irish people are very tricky to know where you stand with because we can be fickle as well. You know, we definitely can. Um, and say things we don't mean all the time, make promises we can't keep. So I've had to adapt and learn because if you're in Ireland and you can't take a slagging, or as Kevin Bridges put it, fat shaming existed when you were in school. Aye, you got fat shamed, skinny shamed, your dad's an alky shamed, your mum would get it shamed. You had to take it, you got can he take a shame and shame? And like he's Scottish, but we're very similar in our humour style. Can he take a shame and shame? That's what I liked because I was there thinking, yes, absolutely. Like, you have to be able to. In Ireland and the UK, and I think the Scots are more similar to us. But like, if you if you can't take it, you can't take a shame and shame. People would say, "Oh, you're soft if you can't take a slagging," but they would use that, you know, and they'd see and they'd pick up on the fact that I didn't know when people were slagging when they were just blatantly taking the piss out of me. I was very bad at figuring that out, so I've had to adapt, you know, as a survival mechanism. Otherwise, you just get ripped into all the time. And I've seen it happen with other autistic people too, because they don't know whether they should be offended or just laugh along. And then all the humour is at their expense. You know, it's not reciprocal. But people will say it's just slagging or it's just banter. So there could be a whole list of these contraindications if one paid attention to them and if people accepted them. All right. How well do we understand the causes of autism? It's a good question again. A lot of very good questions here by the interviewer, I must say. Our understanding is still very primitive, I would agree. We are so ignorant about how the brain works when interacting with other people. It's such a complex field due to the brain being as complex as it is. Exactly. Very complex. There are massive reasons to believe that autism is a genetically caused disorder. However, it's not one gene or two genes, it's hundreds. That's the difficulty. And all those genes work together in the context of your environment. So many environmental causes have been studied and ruled out, such as pain relief medication, Tylenol, paracetamol, vaccines, and what you might call toxic parenting. Um, Donald Trump won't like to hear this, but Tylenol doesn't affect it, so wipe that out. That's not real. Donald Trump is not a doctor, as much as he thinks he is. It's just there, so it's not caused by a parenting style. It's something to do with this tricky brain of ours. So there are some non-genetic causes that do lead to an increase in the likelihood of autism, such as valproate, a medication used to treat epilepsy, taken early in pregnancy. But the effects are very small. In other words, we are led towards mainly genetic causes that affect the development of the brain, possibly with different effects at different stages of development. There have been lots of brain imaging studies, but it's not like a traumatic brain injury, which can be seen very clearly. What is going on in the autistic brain is often written about as underconnectivity or overconnectivity between the millions of nerve cells, but it's all completely vague and at a level that we can't quite capture. Our tools are not hypersensitive enough, and we don't have any very good hypotheses. So there is a lot of work to be done. Again, I completely agree. We do not have a biomarker, and I suspect that when we get a biomarker, we need more than one. Yeah, again, agreed. There will be very different kinds of autism, very many different kinds. So again, the interviewer asks, what does all of this mean for how teachers support pupils with autism in the classroom? Very good question again. We need to know what this means for how they're going to be dealt with in the classroom. I think it's useful to make clear distinctions between the different types of children who have been diagnosed as autistic. Yeah, no two individuals are the same, so very good point. Those who are intellectually impaired and are diagnosed early cannot very easily be accommodated in mainstream. They tend to have very challenging behaviour. Yeah, so you can't communicate with them. They're often rocking back and forth and making kind of grunting noises, from my own observations. That was never really a thing with me. I did have challenging behaviour, but I could often communicate when I was comfortable with the person. So they have very challenging behaviour and their symptoms need to be managed in a special facility. But that was said about me that I would need that, and here I am. Then there are children who have been diagnosed as autistic, but who have good language and might once have fitted into the Asperger syndrome category. They can often really benefit from mainstream education, but you have to be concrete in telling them what you want them to do, and you can't assume they understand norms of behaviour as other children do. That sounds very dismissive. I'd phrase that in a different way. So I'd say, don't assume I know something if you're very vague. Be specific if you want me to do something. I'm not trying to piss you off or misbehave, but if you're not specific, I don't understand what the fuck you're talking about. Do you know what I mean? I don't like this line saying, but you have to be concrete in telling them what you want them to do. That's all right, but then this part, and you can't assume they understand the norms of behaviour as other children do. The norms of behaviour, from what I've seen, are children being fake, being sneaky, trying to get you in trouble or get you to do what they want for a laugh because they know that you'll get in trouble because you're more dozy or honest, you don't understand how to lie effectively. And that's what I've seen a lot of. I'm not saying all neurotypical children lie, but they're certainly better at getting away with stuff than autistic kids. And it's easy for autistic people to be the fall guy for bad behavior. It's very much this is geared towards they don't understand the normal behavior, so the other children will be well behaved, but you have to tell these guys or they won't understand, they won't get it, which I think is very dismissive. Finally, we have the extended spectrum. This will mainly be older children or children in later primary. We don't currently have a separate label, but it might make sense to treat them as hypersensitive. Okay, so I'm not sure how I feel about this, but so far it's okay. I'm not sure whether this group is easier to teach or not. If they are incredibly anxious, they might be the ones who won't come to school anymore. That's a big problem. Schools will need to find ways to build trust with these pupils. Work on building resilience might help them. Something that is less likely to work with the neurodevelopmental group. So this point I actually agree with. So I was an incredibly anxious kid, and I'm incredibly anxious now. And again, I was talking to the GP about this on Tuesday. I'm fearful about a lot of things. I worry about a lot of situations. I struggled to sleep when I was younger. Um, Anxiety has ruled my life. So I would definitely say I relate to this. But I was diagnosed much younger, so when they're saying about this group, and I relate to it, but I didn't want to go to school, but I was forced to go to school, and I think that was a good thing, but it was very much kick up the arse, out the door you go, you're going to school whether you like it or not. I even won the perfect attendance award in primary school, even though I hated it, so I still dragged my arse in as often as I could, you know. And I was a very anxious kid, very fucking anxious. I really struggled to push myself to do things. So I do agree with that point. And yeah, it probably wouldn't work with the neurodevelopmental group because you've got the non-verbal kids in that group, I would imagine, who are kind of, rocking back and forth. And I'm not being cruel or anything, that's what you see. They're rocking back and forth. They don't respond when you speak to them. And it's very hard to get them to engage in a task from what I've observed, just my observations as an autistic person. And I can relate to a lot of different areas because I didn't want to, could learn language, but I was there kind of just not wanting to talk to people, or if someone I didn't know spoke to me, even saying, hello, my name is whatever, what's your name? And I go, that's a funny name. But I just kind of go, you know, blank them because I didn't want to speak to them because it was just, I didn't know what to do. I just didn't want to talk to anybody. So, one thing I would say is that teachers often intuitively know what a child needs, even without a diagnosis. A good teacher knows. I would caveat that with saying a good teacher knows what a child needs. A lot of teachers don't seem to manage children very well, and if you get a bad teacher, then God help the poor child. Together with parents, they can work out what the needs are and act on them straight away rather than waiting for an assessment. That's what I would rather say. That's what I would rather see than a long wait for a diagnosis. Right. Yeah. So the specific needs or waiting for an assessment. See, where I cause the most harm or, start fighting with other kids or getting aggressive was when I was forced to do things that made me extremely uncomfortable, like going to after school crash where the kids would always annoy me and try and pick on me. I'd lash out and I'd start hitting them, and I always got punished for it. But when people are going out of their way to poke at you and piss you off, would you not get angry? Like, say for me, a poke with a finger was like getting a pencil, and it was just so distressing, people bumping into me, and I would say my behaviour at home was caused by the environment in school where people are tipping you, trying to annoy you, and I'd get very distressed, I'd get angry, and I'd lash out, I'd hit people. And what happened to me was teachers would then give out to me and say, now, why do you think what you did was wrong? And tell me why I was a bad kid. And I'd be crying, being spoken down to by a teacher. I was there like feeling like a little worthless piece of shit, but I was after getting victimized. That was the truth of it, and then unfortunately that behavior got brought home. I just felt like I was a burden to everybody. So even though it was spotted at age 7, I still feel like a lot of teachers fucked up big time. And I feel like there was my parents forced me to do things that if I had been able to communicate with them better, I would have said, I hate this and I don't want to do it. But I didn't because I felt uncomfortable doing that, you know. I did fear that I would sit my arse doing nothing if I had my own way because the motivation thing I talk about, it's hard for me to get motivated. So if someone said, oh, do you fancy doing X, Y, or Z? I said, yes. So you get some experience, you know. Don't be a lazy fucker. Don't be unproductive. And I think there is value to that, but you can do that to an extreme. And I feel like I've done it and burnt the candle at both ends. She would rather see the parents act on it straight away and teachers than see long waiting lists. Not always easy though when parents are working. Together with parents, the teachers can work out what the needs are and act on them straight away rather than waiting for an assessment. That's what I would rather see than a long waiting list for a diagnosis. Is there anything that mainstream teachers should avoid when working with autistic children? If we think about the reasonable adjustments that schools are expected to make, some of the most common requests are around sensory sensitivities. So, for example, letting a child wear ear defenders or turning down the lights in the room. These adjustments are easy to make, but they have very little scientific grounding. We don't really know what causes the sensory issues, and I think people love the idea of being able to do something about it. Giving a child ear defenders feels intuitive, it feels plausible, but I'm skeptical. Right. As far as I know, there hasn't been any research into finding out whether these sensory adjustments actually improve lives. I've no idea whether it's good for the child or not. It may feel good to them, but not actually be good. One additional thing I want to say is our cultural understanding of the concepts of autism, which has changed so much, is not just affecting ordinary people who might be interested in who they are, it equally affects teachers and other professionals, including me. I've been quite swept up by the autism spectrum idea, and it's only in the past 10 years or so that I have felt things have gone too far, and very slowly I've come to say, no, this is not right. So I want to just kind of go over that point, and we're near the end now, guys. This video is a long one, but I actually want this to be long because it's one I really want to cover. So she talks here about our cultural understanding of the concept of autism has changed a lot. And it's not just affecting ordinary people who might be interested in who they are. It equally affects teachers and other professionals, including me. What I'd like to include in that is I agree with what she's saying there for the most part. Say the families, you know, my family's been through a lot because of me, and additional things and challenges that I have. I feel like the ones who deal with the most shit are the families. There's no mention of that here. Like they talk about it. She talks about it here, where it's the parents and the teachers working together. So we just go back to that example. I do agree with building resilience. That's definitely something that is important. I like that point. I agree with that. But it's talking about children and what should teachers avoid when working with autistic children. So what should they avoid? What mistakes can they avoid making that we've seen previously? So dimming the lights or giving noise cancelling headphones. I do agree, and I just something doesn't sit right with me as an autistic person. Singling a kid out with these ear protectors in the room. As a youth worker, I got to see a kid who was very obviously autistic. Like he was quite unathletic. He sat in the room on his own. He had noise cancelling headphones on all the time, and nobody really had an issue with that. They kind of left him off to his own devices, quite literally. um, but I didn't like the fact that he came in with these noise cancelling headphones on, didn't have much engagement with you. And when you'd ask him, because we'd make food for everybody who came in, and when you asked him, did he want anything, it was just no. And we were like, no, thank you. You had to teach him manners. And, I feel like that's something you should just have anyway. No, thank you. Just a couple of manners. And I feel like in that sense, I agree with Uta here. Um, I do think resilience is something you need to have as well. Like a lot of things, if I hadn't pushed myself to do them, God knows how bad I could be now, how much I would have regressed. But as I say, I've gone the other end and pushed myself to the point of complete fucking burnout. And when you get to that stage, you feel like you can't do the simplest things because it's too much, and it is fucking too much. So I want to use my experience to kind of say I've been at both ends, being at the end where they give you no hope and say you're going to have to go to a special school, you're never going to achieve anything, so get that out of your mind now. And at the other end, getting a degree, playing rugby, being player of the year, learning to drive. learning to go out on your own and work on your own. And I've done all those things in such a short period of time. And I've adapted, and I wouldn't have done that if I hadn't been pushed by mainly my mum. Yeah, we'll give credit to her. And that's why I don't like the fact that families are not given the recognition they deserve because our cultural understanding of the concept of autism, which has changed so much, is not just affecting ordinary people who might be interested in who they are. It equally affects teachers and other professionals, including me, but it also does affect the families big time. More than anyone, I would say, because it's distressing when you see that other kids are doing things and your child isn't. And I know this from speaking to my own mother, you know. Um, yeah, I've been quite swept up by the autism spectrum idea, and it's only in the past 10 years or so that I've felt things have gone too far, and very slowly I've come to say, no, this is not right. So, Helen and Mass, good job, some really good questions there. I'll stop sharing because that's the end of the article. Um, so, a few things. I felt like, as I say there, Helen and Mass asked some really good questions. I don't disagree with everything that Uta Frith has said. I think a lot of what she says makes sense. I agree with a lot of what she says, which I didn't expect it. As I say, this is my first time reading the whole article. I've read snippets of it, snippets, but read the whole thing with you guys. You're reading it as I'm reading it. So the immediate thoughts afterwards are autism is definitely being overdiagnosed, and I think it's harmful for people to self-diagnose on this hand. Then on the other hand, what about someone like myself? And I'm going to give myself a big pat on the back and my family as well. Like, who's pushed and pushed as hard as they fucking can. And as I say, gone from a no hoper, that's what I'm going to say, special school, too aggressive, too violent, never going to achieve anything, won't stick with anything, needs medication, to, working, getting a level 8 honours degree, driving, working in jobs where I'm traveling to and from on my own, doing night shift, and being told when I do apply for reasonable adjustments, which I think are a great idea, keep that hand out for more. But I was told by specialists there, and I'll put that down now, that the adjustments I was asking for weren't that much. I was asking for quite a reasonable amount of reasonable adjustments. And I will just say that things have gotten a lot better. The acceptance I see around autism by the general population and people I've worked with, it's much better. It is like I think we're ungrateful if we say things are worse than ever because they're not. Just watching an interesting interview by Christopher Eccleston, and I really like Christopher Eccleston. I'll say his whole name, just call him Chris. But he was talking about doing the series The A Word. I watched the episode, the first one of that, and didn't really like it. I like Christopher Eccleston, but I really didn't like the way that when the parents find out that their son Joe has autism, they act like, oh, it's a reflection on their parenting, and they act like he's been given a death sentence, which I really didn't like. Because it's not a fucking death sentence, and I feel like the more people share their stories, the better it's going to be for everyone. Um, like taking away people though who are considered high functioning. I was given no hope on one hand, and then I worked really hard, and now I'm considered high functioning. So, which is it? I feel like there's a lot of people who work incredibly hard to get as best a life that they can. They want a better life for themselves. Because if you think that there's a better opportunity for you than sitting in a special school all day, being treated like, and I'm going to use this word, a fucking retard, wouldn't you want to do better for yourself and try and achieve more? Like, it's a pretty bleak outlook if all you think is special school for the rest of my life, being cared for by everybody else. It's quite an upsetting thing to think of. So if you can get better for yourself, are you not going to strive for that? Which is what I thought, and I've always been afraid of ending up in a home or something like that. I was terrified of being taken away, genuinely. And that fear made me drive to better myself. But now I'm getting to a point where I've burnt myself out from doing too much and gotten the degree that I wanted to get, which was not fucking easy, not at all. And the way people seem to look at that is you were able to do this, therefore nothing must be wrong with you. No, I was holding on by a fucking thread, and I've said that before. If I had to do that again, I just wouldn't. I wouldn't do it because I wouldn't be able for that level of stress. But when you hold on, people act like you're fine. There's nothing wrong with you, which is not the fucking case. And I admitted I needed help. I've worked with an occupational therapist, got nothing from that. And even though I Breda, the legend, I love Breda, but we did apply. I'm not blaming her because we did try and we applied to a lot of places. She sent me to Grad Ireland, a jobs fair. I went, nothing. The guy that I met up with, John, who was very helpful again, he even said, "Oh, look, it's not your fault. I wouldn't blame you. This year was not a very good year." So it's disheartening when you see stuff like that. But I also started working with specialists there, which hasn't got me anything, and they're around basically to help find employment. And what they keep saying is your adjustments would be very minimal. You're not asking for a whole lot. Like they can give you an office on your own. And I'm like, no, look, just need someone who can tell me exactly what they expect from me, maybe a bit of extra time to complete tasks. And if I'm told I'm only going to, like, say, for instance, if I'm told I'll be given 3 months, as I was told with another pharmaceutical job I had, 3 months of just training, that's exactly what it is, that people say what they mean and mean what they say. It really throws me off more than a lot of other people. And I mean, I could do the job just as well as them. I'm not putting myself down in that regard, but I can't bullshit as well as they can. Or sometimes I don't have the balls to say I'm not doing that because I wasn't trained in it. I feel like if I'm sitting around doing nothing and they tell me you're off working today, I feel like, oh well, I have to, so I will work. If I'm in a job, I will work, but it really upsets me and throws me off. It makes me anxious because that's my biggest problem, anxiety, when I'm not given specific instructions. It throws me off a lot when I'm not given the proper training, or when I think I'm given the proper training and the employer says, "Why didn't you get this or why didn't you get that?" Because I didn't fucking know. You know what I mean? So better communication. Like I'm the one who's supposed to have communication difficulties, whereas a lot of employers don't tell you the right thing, or when you appear to have everything together and you're actually doing well, you're bullshitting your way through it, which I've learned to master. They just assume you know everything because you're given that impression of, but you actually don't, and the cracks will appear eventually. But you've just learned to get on with the bare minimum of training, and a lot of places just do not give the correct training. They don't teach you very well. A lot of jobs, a lot of schools, it's pointless. The training is non-existent. They throw you in the deep end and shout at you when you fail. That's what I see. And they expect you to be perfect first time. And as I say, us humans are perfectly imperfect. And my voice is going, guys, so I will leave it at that. So those are the things I struggle with. And I feel like without the reasonable adjustments, and Paul from Adult with Autism, who this directly affects because it's in the UK, he said that he would not be able to work without his reasonable adjustments. And he was diagnosed age 30, so would definitely be considered the higher functioning. But I relate to him a lot, even though I was diagnosed much sooner, age 7. I relate to a lot of what he says because he's had to struggle through it, and so have I. And our struggles are different, but I relate to it, and I'm not trying to one up him. I'm just trying to find a common ground with him and say, I get where you're coming from. And yeah, those are my thoughts on Uta Frith's uh, request to disband the spectrum. I think there's some merit to it, but I think it will affect a lot of people negatively in the UK, who couldn't work without their reasonable adjustments. And if you start classifying autism as something else or saying only those who are low functioning are autistic, poor Paul would not, poor Paul, he wouldn't have his reasonable adjustments, and he seems to be quite good at what he does. He was even talking about employment and people not being specific or starting a course that he was doing. And what he describes as having a meltdown, I don't think it was that bad. What he described, like he was acting like he overreacted almost, but he wasn't. And I'm glad that he said it wasn't my fault because he was told the course would start at 9 p.m., sorry, 9 a.m. in the morning, and it started at half 8. And they started going through things, and that would throw me off. He was there early, but they'd already started without him because everybody else was there and he wasn't. So I get where he was coming from. And then he was being bombarded with information. And he asked, "Sorry, am I late?" "Oh, no, you're not late, but everybody else was here, so we thought we'd get a start on it beforehand." And as he said, everyone wasn't here, though. I wasn't here. And I relate to that 100%. If I'm somewhere early, but people have gotten there already, and because everybody else is there, but not me, most people are here, so we'll start without you. I've been in a lot of scenarios like that. I can 100% see where he's coming from. You know, like I was in a job, my only pharmaceutical job, where, and I leave it on this example, but I had to do my clean room gown and training, and I got through whatever work I had to do. I got my laptop out and I showed up for the training 20 minutes before it was supposed to start. So I was there early and I was on the laptop. I'm on the laptop now, but I want to say I was on this phone and I was just making sure that, oh, yeah, yeah, I know what I'm doing. I was on Microsoft Teams because that's what the work chat was. And I was like, okay, training is due to start. And then I noticed that about 5 minutes from it, nobody was setting up. So, the way you have to set up these courses before you go in, nobody was setting it up. So I thought, is anyone coming? So I put it into the group chat, anyone coming? No response. So there were two training rooms in the whole building. So I decided to go upstairs and check out the other one. Ended up interrupting a meeting and no training was going on there. So I came back down, no sign of anybody. And then it was 10 past 2. And I realised that I thought, oh, I'm fucking late. I must be at the wrong building again, assuming I'm the one in the wrong. So I went back into the office where I worked and the utilities department. And I said it to them, I was like, is this training happening? Is anything going on here? And they said, oh, I don't know. They always cancel them. And I was like, well, they shouldn't. And I was like, is there nobody set up to do the course, to actually give it? They were like, they cancel them all the time. And I was kind of like, well, one, nobody told me, and two, why are they just allowed cancelling like that? So then I started stressing out because my boss told me I had to pass that course in order to be given access to the clean room and to do my water sampling. So I ended up having to chase down someone from the clean room who worked there, and she said, "Yeah, no problem. I'll go through it with you." She did it for half an hour, 30 minutes, and then she said, "Oh, you've done well, so I'm happy to pass you." And she did. Got into the clean room, made a few mistakes, not anything significant, but just with buttoning the gown up and a big neck. So made a couple of errors, but then people were asking, well, what training did you get? And I said, oh, I spent half an hour with herself, and they were like, you should have gotten a 2 day intensive course. That's what normally happens. They were like, why didn't you get that? Then you're signed off only when you're comfortable. And I was like, well, I didn't know that. Nobody fucking told me what I was supposed to get. So I was just told by my boss, once you're signed off, forget my pencil now. Once the box is ticked, you're good to go. That's what I did. Um, but it all fell back on me for not having the right training, even though I thought I did, because I thought surely an instructor can't pass you on something unless you've done the adequate amount of work. So I get where Paul is coming from, and that's the kind of stuff that throws me and him off. Obviously, the ones who are able to work, but we need just a bit more time. We need direct instructions, and we need people to do what they say they're going to do, you know, and to not start things without us just because everyone else is there and we're not. If the course says it's at 9 a.m., it should start at 9 a.m. But people do things all the time that they're not supposed to, and we have to fall in line with that. By we, I mean the autistic people who are trying to get by in society. You know, if everyone did what they said they were going to do, wouldn't the world be a great place? But unfortunately, people don't do what they say they're going to do, and we're the ones who suffer as a result. You know, if it says it starts at 9 a.m. and I'm there at half 9, fair enough, or 9:30 if you're American. If I'm late, then fair enough. I've missed it. I'm used to being late a lot of times, but for my safe pass, I was told a different building. I went to that building and I ended up being late for the other. It was actually on at the original building I was told to go to. Then I got told on the day it's changed to another building. So I actually went there and I would have been early for the course had it been on the time it was supposed to be on. I ended up rushing over to the other place. Luckily, it hadn't started yet, and the guy we had doing our safe pass was one of the soundest guys I've ever met. But I got I got flustered. I was sweating. I think I was wearing the same t-shirt as well. The pink t-shirt in front of a load of tradesmen, big, hairy, sweaty, scary men. But I just got on with it, and then luckily he was sound. He said, look, we're grand. We thought we'd give it a few minutes anyway before we started. So he waited for me, waited because there was a few lads that were late, so it was all fine. It seemed like Paul, unfortunately, didn't get that experience, but I get where he's coming from, it flusters me as well. So yeah, I think the fact that I'm able to relate so much to what he said and other people like Quinn, who's much older than me again, no offense, Quinn, even though we're all very different, like he says he's not into sport or competition at all, whereas I would have been quite heavily into competition before, but I can still relate to him, I can empathize, and isn't that something I'm able to put myself in his shoes? And yet us autistic people are told we don't have any empathy. Bullshit. Complete bullshit. I feel like we're able to empathize a lot better than the general population. And I'm just saying it because most autistic people I know are highly empathetic. And if they see that I'm struggling, they do their best to help me out. So I'll end it on that, guys. I think it's a good place to end. Let me know your thoughts. What do you think? Is Uta Frith right? Is she wrong? Does she have some good points, but some really bad points? I think she's a lot of good points, but there's a lot of stuff I disagree with as well. I actually think I agreed with most of what she said, but the overall argument to disband the whole spectrum, like, why would you get rid of the whole thing? I think definitely people are being overdiagnosed, but that doesn't mean get rid of the whole spectrum. People are being overly diagnosed. So the people who need a diagnosis and are struggling but are able to communicate, let's take away their supports. That's the solution. I don't see how you work that one out, guys. As she has said herself and admitted, more research is needed. And until that's done, I don't think you can disband the whole spectrum. I don't think that's fair. I think it would undo a lot of good work that has been done to help people get into the workplace and get employment who would have otherwise been unemployed. Um, and as autistic people reach adulthood, that's the hardest part for them because it's a massive transition. There's never been a bigger transition. Neurotypical people struggle with that. So imagine a heightened sensory system how an autistic person's going to cope, especially in today's climate where everyone's suffering and nobody can get employment or even get an interview. So yeah, those are my thoughts, guys. Let me know yours, and I will see you in the next one. Let me know. It's long before. Bye for now.